So now if I could invite up Ian. Nick, I believe Nick has arrived. Oh, I haven't spotted him yet. And also Graham's come up onto the stage for our next panel session. That would be great, thanks. So we almost jumped the gun, getting straight into the guidelines, but that is what we're going to do next. We are going to talk about the recent revisions to the SCR guidelines. And Ian's going to very kindly talk us through the guidelines themselves, and then we're going to look at the structure of them and basically the interplay between the various people, because that's what the guidelines deal with exactly, in terms of what the SCR can and can't do, and how the interaction between all stakeholders, which, you know, for any casualty is fairly key for all of us. I will do a quick introduction to our speakers and panellists, and then I'll hand over to Ian. So I'll start with Ian Freeman. Who's claims manager at the Americas Syndicate with Steamship. I'm sure many of you know Ian already. I have a quick bio for Ian, also another former mariner. Unfortunately, the room is littered with us today. But Ian was at sea for a similar period of time as myself, as a deck officer on various ships and offshore drilling operations. But it's been at Steamship Mutual since 1994, which I think deserves a round of applause in themselves. Long time. Well done. And most of you will know Ian in his capacity on the IG Salvage Committee and co-representing the IG on the Lloyd's Scopic Committee and from various Lloyd's Salvage Group meetings. So Ian, as I said, will be talking us through the guidelines. Also very grateful to have Nick here. Unlike the Associate Members Day of last year, I hope that Nick is not spreading COVID around the room. Vicious rumour. Oh, right, okay. That was someone else. But most of you know Nick, obviously probably the most high-profile SCR salvage master in the business, I would say. Certainly the only one that's appeared in Vanity Fair, to the best of my knowledge, following the Concordia. But Nick, born in Zambia and raised in South Africa, it's only right and proper that his first time at sea was with South Marine in South Africa when he started in 1980. Had his first LOF as salvage master in 1987, which makes me feel awfully young. And has done many, many high-profile casualties since. He was appointed to the Lloyd's panel of SCRs in 2010, and he currently serves with the Resolve Marine Group as a Senior Salvage Master and Regional Director. And last but by no means least, particularly in terms of sea time, I think, we have Graham Bowles from Brookswell, serving SCR, Master Mariner with experience on bulk carriers, oboes, oil and chemical tankers, which is incredibly useful because we struggle for Master Mariners with that broad range of experience these days. He's been active in the shipping industry for over 50 years, again I feel quite young, and has become a marine consultant in London in 1985, worked as a consultant continuously since then, and first involved in salvage operations in the same year, appointed to the SCR panel in 2010. So I think you'll agree with me, we have a great set of panellists. So I'm going to hand over to Ian to introduce us to the guidelines.
So the guidelines. Not a particularly exciting looking cover page, I'm afraid. That's one thing we failed to do, was to put a picture of a dying ship on there. But nevertheless, there has been quite a revision. Perhaps a little background as to why we're here. Obviously, as Claire mentioned, Scopic came into being late 1999-2000. From that, Appendix B created an SCR committee. Primary role was to set tariff rates and to appoint and vet the SCR panel. Subsequent to that, a few questions were put to the committee who considered them and then gave its points of wisdom out in the form of digests, and there were 5 issued. In 2010, the committee was renamed the Scopic Committee, recognising slightly the wider role it was taking. In addition to the digests, 2014, some guidance notes were produced, which sat alongside the digests as well as introduced some standard formats for the various cost forms. In 2016 is probably when this all started, when the Scopic Committee decided to do a thorough review of all the documentation, so starting with the Scopic clause itself, LOF, which came to Scopic 2018, but then had LOF 2000, And we then went through the codes of practice, and eventually we've left what is potentially the most important document to last, which is the guidelines. So, in some respects, what is the legitimacy of the guidelines? The committee is made up from members of the IG, the ISU, IUMI, and the International Chamber of Shipping. All four parties are entitled to have 3 members sit on the committee. As just mentioned, the first duty is effectively to look at the tariff rates and manage the SCR panel. But subsequently, the advice in providing assistance to the SCR in how to do their work and any provision, questions that are put to the committee, effectively tend to reiterate the strong principles of independence, impartiality, and in the early stages, very much operational questions. The committee would try and find an answer. Less so now, because those questions presumably mainly been resolved and they don't appear before the committee so often, but that is the place that any SCR raising an operational question can put it. And an element of trying to standardise the role. So, in a way, the legitimacy comes from the fact that these guidelines represent the industry sitting behind the salvage industry and have been vetted, as you said, by 13 P&I clubs, all of which I've had a good grilling on when we put it to them. So I'm equally confident that the ISU gave their representatives a good grilling. And so these guidelines have been reviewed and analysed and questioned and changed as a consequence of these parties having vetted them beforehand. That said, they hold no legal power or legitimacy in that sense, and that ultimately, if there is a dispute between a contractor, then you revert back to the SCOPIC clause itself, the contractual relationship. So let's look into some of the detail. I'm only going to point out really what are the changes that sort of highlighted. So it's not a full rewrite. A few of the clauses will be quite recognisable. Others have been amended, and then there are a few new ones. There is a sort of theme of an enhanced reference to the independence, the impartiality, and the need for transparency in the role of the SCR. And I think Dennis's talk beforehand was very useful in seeing how on site Dennis clearly, and I'm sure all SCRs operate with those principles in their mind. There's a name change. Previously it was the SCR roles, now SCR responsibilities. And I think that is trying to really pull in that the SCR is so key to the successful operation of SCOPIC, which in itself, of course, is a wonderful example of a commercial solution to what was otherwise a legal nightmare. Nobody was winning, other than the lawyers, as Claire said, and commercial minds got together, thrashed out a solution, and it works. And I think the figures that Claire showed in terms of the number of arbitrations bears that out. There is that responsibility on the SCR to ensure that continues. There's a couple of definitions being added in the document purely for consistency throughout the document. So in terms of identifying who the parties are, who the interested parties are, and a bit more clearly identifying Lloyd's salvage arbitration branch's role in the document. We've introduced a pointer that the new applications and reapplications to join or remain on the SCR panel have, in the last few years, seen a number of incomplete applications made. Which can be a little bit administratively heavy in trying to resolve that incomplete application. So there's a small warning that the SCOPIC committee may, if they so wish, simply not accept the application purely because it's incomplete. The annual declaration that an SCR is required to make in terms of not being employed by one of the parties to LOF, we've just slightly expanded that to make it clear that it's being aligned to a P&I club or a property insurer, ship owner or ship manager. Moving slightly into the actual operation itself, the appointment of an SCR, as we know, in some circumstances it's difficult to actually physically be on board the casualty, although that is the overall riding requirement is that the SCR is in the heart of the matter and therefore should be on board the casualty where it's possible. Previously, I had a rather unusual reference to where that's not possible, that they can adopt a visiting status. I think we feel that it's very difficult to define what visiting status is. So the point is that the emphasis is you need to be on board, you need to be in the heart of it, but where that's not possible, you discuss that with the appointing party and you seek appropriate instructions, or you seek instructions in order for an appropriate attendance. Equally reflecting that some of the casualties nowadays are substantial and simply can be quite overwhelming for a single person to do the job. In recognition of that, then we're very happy for assistants to be employed. However, the definition of an assistant should definitely be somebody of an equivalent background, qualification, expertise, but nevertheless remains entirely under the direction and the responsibility of the appointed SCR. So these clauses, starting with 6, are the ones that really get into the actual role of the SCR. And it's here that probably there's some of the key changes. Appendix B sets out or defines what the SCR is to do, and of course the overriding requirement is that he or she uses their best endeavours in order to salvage property. And this is aligned with the duty that the salvage master has. And Appendix B says that the SCR is entitled to be kept informed, he's to be consulted with, and he is entitled to offer advice. What we've done in 6.4 is we've padded this out a little bit, it is now a requirement, which I'm quite sure goes on all casualties, but been clear that there should be an open and frank dialogue between the SCR and the salvage master, and the SCR is entitled to have that open and frank dialogue. He's to ensure that not so much that he understands the salvage matter, but that he has been properly informed. Sorry, he or she has been properly informed, that sufficiently so that they can fully understand the salvage plan, and importantly, fully understand the intentions of the salvor, and in some respects what the ultimate objectives of the operation are. This leads on to an important aspect, which is the early consideration of the conclusion of the operation. So the focus is always, at the beginning of the operation, is always to actually the operation to be successful, but it doesn't always go to plan. And the final outcome may well be one which has possibly more than one outcome, more than one option. The emphasis in the guidelines now is that there should be early consideration of where this project is going. I've skipped one there. I missed out 6.1, but it's actually quite a key bit. It's simply to remind an SCR that it's not just the guidelines and the SCOPIC clause itself. There are associated documents, the SCOPIC and LOF, the appendices, the codes of practice. And it's a reminder that an SCR should be familiar with the content of those documents. I've slightly broken that up because leading on somewhat about talking about the enhanced guidance as to what an SCR can expect in the operation, we move into 6.5, which develops that theme, particularly towards a operation which may not be leading to a true salvage of the in the terms of an Article 13 award. We introduced the concept of a managed conclusion, which very much encapsulates the principles of discussion and dialogue, and open and frank, but to identify where the operation is going and what options there are. In fact, the guidelines say particular attention should be given to this aspect of the operation, is to look to the future, look to where the operation is going, and to identify what are the potential options available to all the salved interests. There could be conflicting interests here, but if there is a open dialogue, options are identified, including local factors, which could well be having to manage the local authorities when an operation is coming to an end, to the point that maybe it's going into a caretaker contract and possibly to a wreck removal. Those expectations need to be managed, and again, very much, I think Dennis mentioned it himself. And that's very much now built into the guidelines. It's interesting that on this point, the code of practice between the international group and the ISU, in fact, picks up on this very point, and that there's a requirement for the SCR, the salvage master, and all the interested parties to engage in discussion in respect of potential termination of SCOPIC. Probably goes without saying that an SCR has no authority to amend SCOPIC. It slightly feeds onto a later addition that we've had, of course, is that, which I'd like to come to, related to side agreements. 610 is in the knowledge that many SCRs do produce, in addition to the daily salvage reports, they often produce a wider report, slightly glossier one. And I have to say, as a P&I claims handler, these are the reports which actually make a lot of sense, and generally sort of filling out the detail of the daily salvage report. But of course, there are risks associated with that type of report, and so the guidelines are making it clear that they still have to reflect the same principles of maintaining impartiality, and that in the same way with a daily salvage report, if there are any concerns to be raised, those concerns should go through due process, and effectively that would be discussion with the salvors, if necessary, noted into a daily salvage report, and in a slightly more extreme case, a dissenting report. The extent to an SCR is producing a supplementary report in order to pad that out. We should not be reporting something in the supplementary report which is not really appearing in the daily salvage report. And principles of impartiality have to be maintained. And somewhat following that on, the extent to which disagreements are registered, but they can be resolved. I think the word disagreement is not entirely, I think the phraseology we would use is the SCR is not satisfied. So if having registered is not satisfied with a particular point and that point is subsequently resolved, then it is only fair to record that resolution, and the guidelines now point that out. And well, I think the encouragement remains to use the standard forms as they appear in the appendices, and some questions that we've received over time is that how frequently to make a cost schedule, and we feel that a weekly cost schedule is probably about a reasonable period. Yes, equipment to be demobilised. The previous guidelines had a rather unusual reference to hiding equipment that was unused should be immediately returned. That may well be the correct response, but the guidelines are simply widened to simply say any equipment in which the SCR feels should be demobilised. If that's the case, then the SCR should go through the usual process of raising that concern, noting it on a DSCR if he feels it's not being addressed, and ultimately a dissenting report. Yes, picking up on the earlier point, side agreements, my experience is they're not discussed so much nowadays, but nevertheless there's always a concern that they exist. Obviously this is not the place to discuss side agreements, but the big point about them is that they may well, possibly quite high prospect, prejudice P&I cover. So the request is, in some respects, that in the event that an SCR becomes aware of a side agreement, or any other arrangement which in some way or another is varying the terms of SCOPIC or what might be the final outcome of SCOPIC, that variation needs to be brought to the attention of all parties. So if an SCR is aware of that, then they should bring that to everybody's attention. The 2 points, 13.1, 13.4, these are referring to dissenting reports. Yes, so they're currently required if there's any concern about the conduct of the operation, or if there's any concerns about the quantity of equipment and personnel. This has been expanded slightly to look at the actual objectives of the progress of the operation, its objectives and its final conclusion. The extent to which the SCR is not satisfied with that progress after having gone through the earlier process of discussing openly and noting on daily salvage reports. And that's 13.4, as I mentioned earlier, that where there is a resolution to a problem, then it's right that it should be recorded. So that's effectively the key points that from the actual guidelines themselves. The standard letter, which I know is not necessarily used that often, which is a shame because I actually think it's a very useful document. But there is an additional declaration on the standard letter now to the effect that the SCR will, throughout the duration of the operation, will remain a member of the SCR panel. And I think when I mentioned to Dennis about the final report, that there is... the final report, previously there was 2 versions of a pro forma final report. We were scratching our heads a bit to understand why there were 2 versions, so we've reduced that down to 1. And we've repeated in the SCR application notes the requirement to ensure that the applications to join or remain on the SCR panel are properly complete, photographs and all that sort of thing. So it's a quick whiz through. I think passing on to one of my fellow panel members for next.
Thank you very much, Ian. I don't know if Nick or Andrew wants to just say a few words to kick us off.
I get the sense, and I may be wrong, and proved wrong by the questions session later, but I get the sense that SCRs are generally comfortable, content, whatever, with the new guidelines. When I knew I was going to be sitting here on Friday, I pinged a message around to all the SCRs in the expectation that there would be some substance to be getting my teeth into. The number of responses I had, I could count on one hand, but actually to be honest, I could count on one finger. So I guess that most SCRs are reasonably content, and it's very much, in effect, business as usual. Most of the new guidelines do incorporate what most of us do anyway. They may be just formalised slightly and streamlined, and maybe dot a few I's and cross a few T's. But so there's reasonably contented. So well done, Ian.
Yeah, well, obviously it was a project which involved a lot of people, which certainly my thanks to, let's hope we don't have to do it again for a while. I would like to just sort of pick up a little bit on that, though. I think it's right to say that it is business as usual. And it's just a review of what already existed. But I think there has been some key introductions. the emphasis really building on what already exists is one of discussion and dialogue, and also the recognition that there's a role for everybody to play when the operation in the sort of latter part of the operation, the bit that isn't necessarily always thought about when everybody's jumping on flight to get out to the casualty. That we feel is quite a key part of the operation as a whole, is its ultimate aim. And certainly I feel that that's quite a key addition to the guidelines.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think it's great that we've got the consolidated roles and responsibilities in a single document, not just for the SCRs themselves, but for all the parties. So the appointing parties, other interested parties who might not have been exposed to the SCOPIC regime before, they can actually have a look at it and actually get a better feeling of the role of the SCR. From the ISU's perspective, we think that it's good because it's clarifying a couple of the clauses and roles and responsibilities where there might have been different interpretations. So there's been a lot of feedback from the SCRs, from the ISU, within the SCOPIC committee on interpretation of some of the clauses and maybe tweaking them so that they're actually pretty clear. And I think this document actually has done that. So it's actually defined and changed the language of the clauses so that everyone agrees exactly what that role and responsibility is. And that can only benefit on the ground itself. Obviously, we think that it's a collaboration with the SCR and the Salvos. We'd like to see people like Dennis being more frank with their discussions and not being so intimidated by the process. That would be an achievement. And the SCR is certainly there to add value to the whole operation and give that feedback. So it's got to be open, transparent, build up that trust relationship as soon as possible. But then again, you have different scenarios. So you have a more optimistic plan, and then you have flags that come up as you lose double bottoms and something along the way. So you actually have to have these flags and say, well, if this flag comes up, we're going to plan B or C or Z. And until you get to a point where you say, all right, it's not going to be a successful Article 13 or solved value, and what is the conclusion of the process? So if you don't have those discussions all the way along and a complete understanding of what's going on, then you're missing the objective. So I think this guideline is perfect. It's going to be around for quite a while. Ian wants to retire, but if we have to redo it again, we can't retire. So hopefully there won't be any objections to that extent. But yeah, congratulations to all involved. And I think that it's interesting to get the questions from the floor, but it's a big step forward.
Thank you. And if I may sort of just add some observations from my side, I'm going to be able to be careful here, because I don't know, Ian, did you write the original guidelines?
No.
Excellent. Did anyone in this room write the original guidelines? Brilliant, okay.
Yeah, the original guidelines, which were prepared in 2018, I think, they were a consolidation, so they took all the various bits out of the 5 digests. And there was another document at the time, I think, guidance notes. And the whole point was, why did we have all these documents effectively telling the SCRs what to do? So they were consolidated into previous guidelines. But the point about that consolidation was they didn't really review it, they didn't change it, they just brought it all together into one document.
Thanks, Ian, that makes sense. So what I was going to say, which is slightly offensive, the original guidelines, when you compare the two next to each other, the first set almost looked like they were written during the smoko. Because, it's sort of true abrupt start. Okay, we must do this, and this, right, done that, move on. Whereas the new ones are much more eloquent and quite obviously based on lessons learned. Because as you read through them, having experienced those casualties, you can kind of in your mind think, okay, well, yeah, that's where that didn't go quite so well, that could have done better, or, yeah, that was actually a very good example of how we did it on this case. So it certainly reads like that. Do we have questions from the floor on the changes to the guidelines? We've got one at the back. Oh, Richard Gunn, if we could get Richard Gunn a mic, please. Not that he needs one.
Thanks, everybody. I just wanted to clarify something that Ian said, and I hope it doesn't take offence to this. There was a reference to the code of conduct between the ISQ and the international group, and Ian said that it sort of agreed that there should be discussions as regards to the termination of Scotland. I think that was a misphrase. In fact, what the code of conduct says is that there should be discussions between the SCR and the salaries master as regards the termination of the salary services. And that's a very different thing to the termination of Scotland. Termination of Scotland is something for the club and the owners, obviously. And I think it's recognised that the owners of the club would need to take separate advice as to the termination of Scotland, whereas the SCR's role is to board the property on board. The date of the services started, at least when Scotland was in there, and with a view to termination for the completion of salary services. That's about success and a useful result as opposed to the termination of Scotland. So I just thought I'd clarify that.
Yeah, I didn't fully hear that. But I'm seeing as Richard and I were sitting at the same table discussing these, I'm sure he's right. If I agree, it's not so much a case of the termination of Scotland per se, it's about bringing the whole operation to an end.
Thanks, Ian. Do we have any other questions on the guidelines? I mean, I suppose an obvious one is, are they online already? Where are they found? Are they ready to go?
They should be on Lloyd's Salvage Arbitration Branch website. I know that Kevin, sometimes from Lloyd's, sometimes has difficulty getting that process of getting them onto the website, and I haven't checked myself. So, Kevin, are they there?
Not yet.
Sometime next year it'll be all right.
Thanks, Ian. I think one other thing sort of occurred to me sort of reading through the new guidelines. Obviously, there's more of an emphasis on record keeping, which is a lawyer's dream. But I questioned whether there was an increased burden in the guidelines, and if so, for anybody. But I mean, based on what you said, Graham, I'm not sure that's the case. Do you look at the guidelines as an SCR and think, okay, suddenly things have become a little bit tougher for me, or happy with how they developed?
Happy with how they've developed. Basically, it's more of the same. I think from where I'm sitting, others may see it differently, but I don't think it changed anything fundamentally. It more or less defines the rules that are clear, sometimes ambiguous. But it's much business as normal. Hence the response I had in my request for feedback. But everybody seems to be happy with it.
Thanks, Graham. So, I suppose, did anybody else have any other views on the guidelines? Did anybody else see anything particularly controversial and something that's going to come to light in the future? No, excellent news. Oh, Ben, we have a question from Ben, I think. You have a microphone at the front, please. Or a comment.
Just a comment. If anyone wants the guidelines, you can get them. So they have been published to kind of all the SCRs. If anyone else wants to see a copy of the guidelines and have a read through them and make sense of some of the discussion today, if you haven't already seen them, then feel free to ask someone and we can get a copy to you. There's nothing kind of confidential about them. The whole system, as it's being described, is that everyone understands, all of the stakeholders in any given situation understands how the mechanisms between LOF, SCOPIC, the respective owners, cargo, P&I, home machinery, to make all of that work. Although on the one hand it can look like a relatively benign document with most relatively simple instructions, there's a lot of subtlety in it. I think that's the main point to draw out of this, that this is a document that helps make all of the policies fit together. So in that sense we encourage everyone to have a read of it, and if anyone hasn't got a copy, just ask. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Felt a little bit like you were selling CDs then, but there's no charge, right?
Oh, there is a charge.
Fair enough. Okay, well, do we have any other questions or comments from the floor? As Speak now or forever hold your peace. No? Okay. Thanks very much to my panellists. Well done. Much needed coffee, everybody.